From a private hospital for the insane near Providence, Rhode Island, there recently disappeared an exceedingly singular person. He bore the name of Charles Dexter Ward, and was placed under restraint most reluctantly by the grieving father who had watched his aberration grow from a mere eccentricity to a dark mania involving both a possibility of murderous tendencies and a profound and peculiar change in the apparent contents of his mind. Doctors confessed themselves quite baffled by his case, since it presented oddities of a general physiological as well as psychological character. In the first place, the patient seemed oddly older than his 26 years would warrant. Mental disturbance, it is true, will age one rapidly, but the face of this young man had taken on a subtle cast which only the very aged normally acquire. In the second place, his organic processes showed a certain queerness of proportion which nothing in medical experience can parallel. Respiration and heart action had a baffling lack of symmetry. The voice was lost, so that no sounds above a whisper were possible. Digestion was incredibly prolonged and minimized, and neural reactions to standard stimuli bore no relation at all to anything heretofore recorded, either normal or pathological. The skin had a morbid chill and dryness, and the cellular structure of the tissue seemed exaggeratedly coarse and loosely knit. Even a large olive birthmark on the right hip had disappeared, whilst there had formed on the chest a very peculiar mole, or blackish spot, of which no trace existed before. In general, all physicians agree that in Ward, the processes of metabolism had become retarded to a degree beyond precedent. Psychologically, too, Charles Ward was unique. His madness held no affinity to any sort recorded in even the latest and most exhaustive of treatises, and was conjoined to a mental force which would have made him a genius or a leader had it not been twisted into strange and grotesque forms. That, my friends, is from The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, a terrifying novel by H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P. Lovecraft. One of his most famous stories, actually. A lot of people know about this one. It is one of his only novels. It's a short one, but it does qualify. Let me read you what Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi has to say about this story. Immediately after completing the Dream Quest, Lovecraft began a second short novel, working from January to March 1st, 1927. This work may have had its origin in a novel about the Salem witchcraft that Lovecraft was contemplating in 1925 upon his return to Providence. He evidently decided to set it in his hometown. It is Lovecraft's longest work of fiction, and its rich evocation of Providence topography and history is unmatched in his work. Lovecraft found many details in Gertrude Selwyn Kimball's Providence in Colonial Times, 1912, but Lovecraft himself dismissed the novel as a cumbrous, creaking bit of self-conscious antiquarianism, and never prepared it for publication. It first appeared in Beyond the Wall of Sleep, 1943. Well, that's true. The first complete appearance appeared in 1943 in the Arkham House book, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, but it did appear before in abridged form in 2 issues of Weird Tales. That would be the May and July 1941 issues of Weird Tales. That was when Charles Ward first terrified people. So the case of Charles Dexter Ward, at the beginning of this story, Charles Dexter Ward, who has gone mad, as I described in that little bit, has disappeared from the asylum. Just up and vanished. Pretty mysterious. Sort of a locked room mystery of a sort. He was there, and then he was gone. Which leads you to the story of Charles Dexter Ward. Charles Dexter Ward, a young man who became obsessed with his ancestor. He learned about his ancestor through his antiquarian research and genealogical research, because this guy is Charles Dexter Ward was a lot like Lovecraft, in that he was very interested in old things, old times, and the history of his family. So he found out about this creepy dude, Joseph Curwen, who lived before the Revolution, and was an all-around creepy guy. It turns out Joseph Curwen, the long-lived Joseph Curwen, this guy, he lived a long time in Providence and yet never seemed to get any older, because he was a necromancer, wouldn't you know? He was way into business, he had a shipping company, but eventually he just became too creepy for his own good. A lot of strange experiments going on at his old farmhouse out in the country. I'll tell you this much. Part of his evil necromancy was that he had kind of a conspiracy going on along with these other long-lived necromancers around the world, where these guys, they would dig up the dead and use their magic powers to revive and torture them, to reveal their information so they could gain knowledge to further cause evil, of course. So this Curwen guy, bad news. Bad news, this guy. Eventually, like I said, he got too evil for his own good and was destroyed by some local townspeople. I don't think that's giving too much away, because all the big secrets come later on in the story. Although that section of the story is pretty creepy about necromancer Curwen. And also how his experiments to bring back the dead could sometimes, you know, go horribly wrong, causing blasphemous abnormalities and monstrous creatures. Got to have some of that going on in Lovecraft. So our guy, Charles Dexter Ward, becomes obsessed with this ancestor of his. Of course, he doesn't believe at first any of these stories about him being, you know, a wizard. That's just crazy talk. But he decides to learn all about this guy, which, you know, he just shouldn't have done. Because it all goes bad the more he learns about this guy and becomes basically obsessed with his ancestor. And terrible, terrible things ensue, which seems to drive him mad. But is there even something worse behind his madness? Oh, I think it's a pretty good bet. Good story. And it has a pretty good character in Dr. Marinus Bicknell Willett, Dr. Willett, who becomes a kind of paranormal investigator during the course of this story. He is the doctor who is taking care of the Ward family for years and years. He's an old guy. A lot of Lovecraft's characters are old guys. And so he decides to look into what's going on with Ward. There's a scene where when he's investigating this guy, Curwen, he goes to the location of the old Curwen farmhouse. It is one of the creepiest scenes in all of Lovecraft when he's journeying in, around, and under this farmhouse and discovers ghastliness. Some of the most disturbing moments in Lovecraft come in that particular scene. It's great. There's a lot of really great things about this story. There are some things about this story that are not so great. But for one thing, it's very predictable. I mean, the twists, there are a couple of twists in this story that you see coming pretty much a mile away. I mean, if you've ever read horror at all, and of course you have if you're reading Lovecraft, not much comes as a surprise in this story. but it's still really interesting, and it's a really great read. The sense of place, Lovecraft always, when he writes his story, tends to have a really strong sense of place, and it's never been stronger than in this story, because he sets it in Providence, his hometown, and he does a wonderful job of it. He mentions a ton of locations, which is why reading it in the new annotated H.P. Lovecraft is great, because in this book, the case of Charles Dexter Ward is heavily annotated with notes and locations. So, you know, if you have this book, you can check out all the locations that Lovecraft was talking about. And there's, you know, it's pretty cool. Because, I mean, there's just a ton of stuff, real life stuff that he's talking about in this story. And the locations are all real places. So that's kind of interesting in itself. The character of Charles Dexter Ward is pretty interesting. He has a strong character with Willett and a very strong character with Kerwin, who is just absolute evil. Just a nightmare, this guy. This evil necromancer. The scene of his downfall is terrific. Like I said, not everything is great in this book, but you know what? This was a first draft. He wrote it once and put it in a drawer and forgot about it. He was pretty critical of his own work. And he was pretty critical of this one, I believe, because I think he saw a lot of its shortcomings without seeing its strengths. There is a lot of strengths in this book, and it's unfortunate that he didn't see how good some of this stuff was. Or if he did, he felt the bad parts were just too much, and they're not. This is a pretty strong story. It is a novel, but it's a short novel. It doesn't take too long to read this book. And some really creepy stuff in this book. Like I said, this was the second attempt at a novel after The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. And these two novels could not be more different. This novel, I think, works much better as a novel. It's not a Cthulhu mytho. It's not a real mythos, although there's mythos stuff mentioned in it. So it fits right in. It's right in there in the Lovecraft world. The dark magic is pretty terrifying in this story. Some of it is a little silly. But it's pretty scary as well. It's an unsettling story in places. So I highly recommend it. Highly recommended the case of Charles Dexter Ward. I hope you check it out, because it's awesome. So that was your Mythos Monday for today. Tomorrow would normally be Tag Tuesday, but I'm moving my tag off to Friday, I think. And tomorrow will be another journey with the books that time forgot. So yeah, hope you enjoyed your Mythos Monday for today. Catch me next week for more Lovecraft fun, and you have a great day.